Like a ghost, a killer managed to escape a crime scene and has never been caught. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Chaim Weiss. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, of course, hello, my name is Mike. I tell 3 true crime stories a week here on the YouTube place of business. What? That was weird. I tell stories on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I also tell short-form true crime stories over on TikTok. I have about 3 million followers or so over there, so feel free to subscribe to that place. What? Nope. Follow me on that place. Words are very difficult these days, yeah. The link to my TikTok will be up here at some point in the beginning and at the end. It's also linked in the description of this video below in the link tree. Also in the link tree is the link to my Discord server. Feel free to join it, but be over the age of 18 or you're going to get kicked out of there. Sorry, not sorry. I also sell merch, also linked in the link tree. We ship all over the entire world, universe, and galaxies of the Guardians. That's backwards. I'm a hot mess today. And lastly, if there's a case you want me to cover, please just email me, makingatruecrimerertwo. I will also put that in the description below, but just email me the name of the person, where it happened, when it happened, and I'll add the case to my list. It may be a long time before I get to it because I pick my cases at random, to be fair. So it'll happen one day, I just can't tell you when. Anyway, let's get into today's case. The hand things need to end immediately, okay? Chaim Weiss was born on September 29th, 1971. And at the time of this case, he is living in Long Beach, New York. Chaim was one of 3 children, and his grandparents were actually refugees who escaped the Nazis. Chaim and his family were Orthodox Jews. And Chaim, at the time of this case, was attending the Torah High School in Long Beach, New York. And part of the high school, there was a dormitory that all of the students lived in, or most of the students lived in. The dormitory that he was living in was located on 63 East Birch Street. And he was living on a 3rd floor room, and he was one of the very few students, if only, who actually did not have a roommate. He had his own room. Torah High School, I guess, was a yeshiva, and that's a school that it really kind of emphasizes the religious principles of Orthodox Judaism. It's very much about making sure the traditions of Orthodox Judaism is taught. I honestly don't really know a whole lot about Chaim Weiss, as you know, who he was. I do know at the time of this case, he was a 15-year-old kid. The little I do know is that he was described as a very kind young man, very mature for his young age. He was generous, he was outgoing, he was joyous, he was full of energy, full of laughter. He loved playing basketball, and he was, by all regards, considered one of the favorites at the school. He was liked by everyone. There was really no one who openly disliked him. There was no one who ever picked on him. From what I understand, he had no enemies at school or even outside of school. The dormitory he was staying in housed roughly 40 students or so. The room he was living in, basically there was one way in, one way out, and that was the door. There was a window to his room, but again, this is on the 3rd floor. There's no, ladder access on the outside of it. So the only way someone gets into that room and out of it is through his bedroom door. So this story actually happened on Halloween night in 1986. The day was really, really normal for Chaim, and he went to classes. He attended, I guess, the services that were after class. And then he was seen going back to his dormitory after the services were done. Later on in the evening, now because with Orthodox Judaism, they, from what I understand, I'm not too well versed on them, but I guess at the school they really practiced this, that the students would have no lights on in their rooms, and that was part of kind of like the codes of conduct. And so they would keep the lights on in the hallways, and that's where many students would usually read at night, is in the hallways. And so there were a couple of students who noticed that Chaim was outside in the hallway later that night, on Halloween night, reading a book. He seemed completely normal. He was just lost in his reading, and that was pretty much it. The time that the students say they saw him reading in the hallway was at approximately 1 a.m. Now, on November 1st, 1986, at approximately 7 a.m., one of the staff there at the dormitory noticed that Chaim was late for the Shabbat prayer. And so the staff would go to his dorm room to check on him to see what was going on. I believe from some places I read, he was actually kind of sick around this time, like nothing major, but just like a cold or something like that. So they kind of just at first assumed that maybe he overslept because of that, but it wasn't that. When the staff member entered his room, it was something that they were not expecting to see. 15-year-old Chaim Weiss was lying halfway on the floor and halfway on the bed. The image I'm showing for this is a recreation from the show Unsolved Mysteries. It's not the actual image. But Chaim Weiss, this 15-year-old kid, was dead. There was a blood stain on his pillow. There was a blood stain on the floor a few feet from where he was, and then underneath him was another blood stain. What the coroner would later determine was that Chaim was killed with at least 2 very sharp blows to the back of his head with something like a hatchet or some kind of bladed weapon. Everybody there would tell detectives, or at least the people who saw the crime scene, would tell detectives that it was evident that whoever may have done this may have been an Orthodox Jew as well, or Orthodox Judaism played into this. Now, because the Shabbat prayers were going on, there really were no witnesses to this, because no one can say they saw him after 1 o'clock in the morning and up until the point where he was found. So there's a 6-hour gap of time between when he was last seen alive and when he was found dead. And so everyone was at the prayer, so nobody saw anything. So where Orthodox Judaism plays into this is when Chaim was found halfway on the floor, and according to, the Orthodox, it's the body, once a person is dead, the body has to be at the lowest, coolest point of wherever they are. So in the room, the floor would have been the lowest and coolest point. It was very obvious that his body had been moved not once, but twice. He was obviously killed while he was in bed. He was then moved to the floor. They then moved him again. So they believe they moved him to the floor out of, I don't know if it was out of respect for Orthodox Judaism or what. So I don't know if that means the killer was trying to respect that. It seems kind of unclear. But the other thing is that Chaim's dorm window was open, and it was freezing cold. It was really, really cold this particular evening. So there's no reason why the window would have been opened, especially considering Chaim was sick with something like a cold around this time. So the detectives learned that this was a customary thing to do in the room that someone dies. You're supposed to leave the window open that allows their spirits to leave. Another thing that goes with the Orthodox is they would one of the staff would light a candle in the room where Chaim was killed, and it was supposed to be as like a gesture of sympathy for Chaim. It's part of their custom. And it was supposed to be in the room and lit for 7 days. And it's just one candle. However, when they come back into the room like a day or so later, there's a second larger candle placed and lit next to the other one. The interesting thing about this is because this was now a crime scene, The room was sealed and the students were basically moved out of the dorm room temporarily. So who got into the room to put that second candle in there? There was no evidence of anyone entering or leaving the room. There was no, like, first of all, the murder weapon wasn't in the room. There was no blood drippings coming from whatever weapon they were using, from the bed to the door down the hallway. There was no blood at all outside of the room. No blood on the handles, no blood on the floor, the doors, nothing. There were apparently, from what I understand, no fingerprints. There was, however, a single strand of hair left behind that did not belong to Chaim. It was just a tiny piece of hair, though. So this could potentially be DNA evidence. However, to my understanding at this point, they still haven't tested it for DNA because once you test it, it's destroyed because it's such a tiny piece of hair. But that was the only evidence of the killer in the room. And it's borderline scary and creepy because they couldn't have left through the window. First of all, no one saw someone putting a giant ladder outside of the room. Someone would have noticed and heard something. There were windows below his room. People would have heard this. So no one came in through the window, but that means someone came in through the door. The other interesting thing and kind of the creepy thing is that they were wondering at first, like, was this a targeted attack or was it random? Well, the thing, like I said earlier, is that Chaim was one of only, I think, 2 total students who had their own room. And so the killer had to know that. And the killer, their names aren't on their doors. And I don't even think there's door numbers on their doors. It's just, so the killer had to know that Chaim, as a single occupant room, was in that particular room. So it appears targeted. So is that how they entered? And the thing is nobody saw anybody out of place. Nobody saw or heard anyone walking around the hallways at that time of night. Now, granted, a lot of them were probably asleep. There was one student who said they think they heard their dorm room door open and then immediately close. And that person just assumed it was the roommate that person had in the room with them. But that was it. But what about the witnesses? What about what they may have heard or overheard? Or, when police tried to ask all the other students questions, what did they have to say? Nothing. Literally nothing. Another aspect to Orthodox Judaism that played into this, especially the investigation portion, is this happened after the Sabbath. And according to custom, no one was allowed to say anything to police if they don't have proof of what they're saying, or any evidence or additional witnesses to back up what they're saying. So essentially, because of their custom, they were not allowed to point the finger or accuse or, suggest anything if that person didn't have actual proof of it. They could not just speak on rumor, and they could not just speak on hearsay. It was part of the custom. So that also made the investigation kind of difficult. So detectives are kind of at a loss. They were like, well, we can't question anyone. They were allowed to polygraph several students and many faculty members, but none of those tests came back with anything concerning. As far as they knew, nobody was lying about what they knew. There was no forced entry into his room. So the door wasn't kicked in. There was nothing stolen from his room. Nothing was rummaged through. He was not sexually assaulted. He was just killed with a couple of blows to the back of the head with a hatchet-like weapon. And then the killer just left like a ghost, just completely vanished without being seen. So they wanted to find out, okay, well, what was Chaim like at school? What was he doing the day of? Again, by all accounts, what people were allowed to say about the case when they were questioned was that Chaim was a really likable kid. Everybody seemed to like him. He didn't ever get into any fights. He didn't have any enemies. He just was your normal kid in school. He was super nice. He was popular, super intelligent. He had been at that yeshiva for about 2.5, close to 3 years. His dad would say that as far as they knew, Chaim never said there was any problems with kids at school. Chaim said he always felt very comfortable there, very happy there, very content. His dad, Anton, would later be interviewed and say that, perhaps there were things going on at the school that maybe they weren't considered normal, but they were normal for kids. It was just like normal kid stuff. But none of that would suggest anything. Chaim's mom actually didn't even want Chaim to go to the yeshiva, but Chaim said, I need to go. I feel like I will do really well there, and it'll help me with my future, and I'll excel there. Again, like I said earlier, after they interviewed people with what they were allowed to say, there was nothing abnormal about Chaim the day of his murder. He went to class, he studied, he went to services afterwards. He was seen reading in the hallway like many students do, like he did all the time. That wasn't unusual. And then he was just killed. And then they're trying to focus on how the killer even did this. How did they get in? The dormitory, from what I understand, isn't like a secured building, like it isn't like Fort Knox or anything, so it's relatively easy to enter. There was a stairwell that led from, like, I guess one exit of the building on the bottom floor that would have gone right up to the third floor, right by where Chaim's room was. And he or she could have entered that way, but they're not really sure. They don't have like fingerprints or shoe impressions or anything to like link to anyone. Chaim's room was at the end of a hallway that he would have passed by. The killer would have passed by several rooms and some wood floors. It would have been loud footsteps. Nobody heard a thing. Or nobody is sharing they heard anything because they couldn't back it up with proof. So it is possible that there were witnesses who may have seen or heard something, but because of custom, they weren't allowed to talk about it without having that backup, that proof. They tried seeing if there was anyone in Chaim's outside life that may have led to this, but they couldn't find anything. They would put out, in the newspapers and on the news, like, we need tips, we need something, we need anything, because we're not getting much help from the students or the staff because of customs, which is understandable, and they do have to respect that, but nothing from the outside world either. The detectives on this case could not come up with a suspect because of how positive Chaim's life was. They couldn't even come up with a motive. Like, why did this happen? Who did this? For what reason? A strange person went directly to Chaim's room and butchered him with some kind of hatchet and then just left. Again, like a ghost, like the wind. There was only one person who ever came forward with any type of evidence. I guess a jogger on the morning that Chaim's body was found. The jogger was doing his normal jog. At about 7 o'clock in the morning, he saw a young teenage boy sitting on the bench just a block or two away from the yeshiva. The jogger went to police with this information because he thought maybe this was a student from the school. Maybe this was a student that escaped the school or something, but any attempts they have made to identify that particular student has gone unanswered, unsuccessful. An FBI profiler would be brought in, and they came up with, their own profile, their theory that the killer was likely, or probably more than likely, definitely, someone that Chaim knew, and that this is probably someone that knew him very well and was probably about the same age as him. The profile says that the murder was very likely pre-planned. This was a premeditated murder. This was not an act of randomness. They think that Chaim's success, Chaim's intelligence, Chaim's likability may have been the driving factor that led to the killer's motivations. That this may have been like an act of anger, jealousy. And the killer is also considered highly intelligent and someone that could plan this kind of attack and be able to get away with it for as long as they have, but also to not really leave any traces of themselves. Like they entered that room and they left that room without anybody seeing or hearing, without any physical evidence of their existence in that room, other than a tiny piece of hair that they're terrified to test because it could be destroyed. And they're not even sure if it has DNA in it. One theory that some people have come up with was that it was Halloween night. There was rumors from the outside, not coming from the students directly at the school, but from the outside, that some of the kids at the school may have been picked on or taunted by kids from the outside on Halloween nights, like eggs being thrown at them, tricks being done. and there was confirmed that there were like neighborhood kids, or thugs that they called them, that were kind of just being assholes that night. But none of that led to, that connected to the investigation at all. Because there's no evidence that Chaim was even part of the kids that were being harassed. Could have been a random, this is Halloween, and so maybe someone wanted to do something crazy on Halloween, and they wanted to do a thrill killing because of the holiday. And what better place to do it, right, than in, this yeshiva? But police were like, based on the profile the FBI gave, they're like, that doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem like that's probably what happened here. I mean, maybe, but unlikely. His case just went cold, and because of the uncooperativeness of the fellow students, again, for customary reasons, which is completely understandable and respectable. But the case was at a standstill, and there was really nothing else they could do because they got nothing from anyone. They would reopen the case in 2013 as a cold case. They interviewed about 100 or so former students from the school plus staff. They even went to Israel to see if they can track down students who were there that had then traveled, obviously many years later. But still, they weren't getting any more information from anyone. But it's in 2013 when police would pretty much announce that whoever killed Chaim was almost certainly a student or a faculty member at that school. There were no faculty or staff members present in the dorm room, however, dormitory, on that night, which is actually a criticism that Chaim's parents would later come up with, how come there were no adults in the dormitory that night? The other criticism is that the exit door by where, the killer may have entered and come up to the third floor, that door had been broken for some time. And for a very long time, and they never bothered to repair it. If that's how the killer entered, then that's a problem. In 2017, Chaim's dad Anton would do an interview, and he kind of brought forth some not new information necessarily, but just some bits of tidbit, Apparently in July of 1986, a few months before the murder would happen, Chaim was attending a summer camp. And at one point, I guess he called home crying and saying that he really wanted to come home. And that was not normal for Chaim. This was completely abnormal because he always got along with everyone. So then Anton would go to the summer camp shortly after this to visit him, but then Chaim was back in good spirits and he was happy. Then in August, Chaim would visit, of 1986, Chaim would go and visit Europe. He would visit his grandparents. Apparently, while Chaim was in Europe, he received at least 2 phone calls from the principal of the yeshiva he had been attending, where he was eventually killed. And apparently, this rabbi kept asking Chaim when he was returning back to the States. When Chaim got back to the States, apparently this rabbi asked if he could come to the rabbi's house for a conversation. So Anton, his dad, would take him to the rabbi's house. Chaim would go inside, have this conversation, while Anton and Chaim's mom stayed outside. When Chaim got back to the car, he seemed incredibly reluctant to say what the conversation was about. And then a couple months later, Chaim is found murdered in his room. Anton would, in this interview in 2017, would say it's one of his biggest regrets that he didn't press further into what this conversation was with this rabbi. And there were attempts for news stations to go and interview the rabbi, but he would always be really go away. I don't want to be on camera. You can see him on camera being go, get out of my face. Not saying he's a suspect, it's just that, these are questionable things. Why were you calling him, this 15-year-old student of yours, while he was on vacation? Why did you want him to go to your house? But it hasn't led anywhere at this point. Chaim's family would eventually sue the yeshiva, and this is because they failed to protect him, obviously. They didn't repair the broken door. I guess during one of the court hearings with regards to this lawsuit, that same rabbi would kind of be accusatory towards Anton, his dad, Chaim's dad. And he apparently said something along the lines of that Anton needed to reflect on any bad deeds that he may have committed, considering what happened to his family. It was very cryptic, and kind of strange. In an interview again in 2017, 2018, a former student of the same yeshiva who also had the same rabbi as the school's principal said that between 1976 and 1977 that this student had been abused by a faculty member and that the rabbi was keeping it hush-hush. It wasn't the rabbi committing the assaults or whatever you want to call it, but the rabbi knew about it and was just allowing it to keep happening. A couple of years before Chaim's murder, another student had ended their own life in the dormitory. For what reasons, I'm not really sure. But was there something going on in that dormitory at that school that wasn't reported, that was being kept very hush-hush? Is this another reason why the students didn't want to talk? Were they afraid? I do understand they had their customs to not talk, but were the staff there forcing them to not talk and not saying anything? It sounds like something was going on in that school. I mean, it doesn't even sound like it. It looks like something was definitely going on in that school between staff and students. But what that exactly is not 100% known. I know detectives know about it, but they can't do much without physical proof or physical evidence. They also can't do anything if no one is going to talk, if no one is going to come forward. You know, this is now decades later, and they are still pleading to the students who were there, now decades later, please come forward. Please have a change of heart. I understand the customs, but please, this is about solving a murder. One of your fellow students was brutally killed inside his own dorm room by a whisper. Like, who did this? They just need to know. His family deserves that. And so they're just pleading still, please, if you have any information at all, to please come forward. Somebody somewhere out there, I think in this case, definitely knows the truth. I think that someone knows exactly what happened, and I think that someone heard something or saw something, and they are just hoping against hope that you do the right thing and come forward. So if that person is you, please, you can contact anonymously. Please call 1-800-244-TIPS. You can also contact the Nassau County Homicide line at 516-573-7788. All calls would be kept confidential. You can be anonymous. You don't have to say who you are. You just need to give them the information that'll help solve this case, because there's a killer out there. I mean, at this point, it is 30 some odd years later. The killer may be dead, especially if it was a faculty member. They may not be. There could be a student who did this and they're still alive and well, thriving with their own family and their own kids and their own job, and they're just living their happy life, even though they brutally killed some kid. You gotta help stop that. You have to. This person can't go on living a free life. This was a horrific murder. And for what reason? So please, if you know anything, please come forward. Chaim Weiss was a very good kid. I mean, genuinely good, respected, well-loved, intelligent young man. Someone did this to him, likely because they were jealous of him, possibly. And so Chaim and his parents, his family, they all should get the justice that Chaim rightfully deserves. But that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. Hope you found it interesting. As usual, please subscribe, give this video a like, follow me over on TikTok, subscribe here. I've already said that, Mike. But and join my Discord server if you want. Merch, recommend the case, shish kebabs on a what? A high. And as usual, as I end every video, I am going to scissor off a part of my tongue. I'm also running out of tongue to cut. So, here we go.